Okay. Welcome, everybody. In 2008, when I arrived in Victoria to begin my term as director of the CSRS, I was blessed that the year before, the Centre's program committee had selected a very gifted poet, Melanie Siebert, as a graduate fellow. Melanie was then working on her MFA thesis. In addition to adding a professional artist's perspective to our daily conversations at the Centre, she also led a number of workshops on the technical and symbolic ways that poetry works to open doors in our imaginations. And Melanie is with us today by very good fortune. I'm so glad to see you here. I was so moved by Melanie's artistic and intellectual contributions to the Centre that I established the Artist in Residence program pretty much immediately, which at that time was a title, an invitation to participate in our community, and office or studio space at the Centre. I'll spare you the long story, but about a year later, Dr. Yvonne Sieu, a professor in our French department who's also with us today, now retired, created an endowment that would allow us to offer an annual stipend as well. And now, 17 years after I arrived, I'm delighted, and I have to say a little bit proud, to be able to look back and see how much this group of painters, poets, novelists, composers, sound artists, photographers, storytellers, Indigenous beaters, playwrights, and sculptors have added to our understanding of religion, spirituality, and society. So first of all, I want to thank Yvonne for her generosity in creating the endowment. As many of you will know, the endowment honors her parents, and it's named after her parents, but it also reflects Yvonne's longstanding commitment to the CSRS. I think you were on the search committee that brought Harold Coward here, and maybe even on the first program committee. So thank you for that. And second, I want to thank all of the artists who have been with us over the years. They've given us so many wonderful opportunities to connect our work as scholars and students to broader issues that also reflect on the role of aesthetics in our work as scholars and teachers. And now I'm very happy to introduce this year's CSRS Artist in Residence, Jacob Maddison, who will let you look over his shoulder at some of the things he's been working on at the Centre this last year. Jacob works in the McPherson Library's Book Arts and Letterpress collection. Before coming to UVic, he completed a BFA at Emily Carr University of Art and Design and an MFA at the Nova Scotia Academy of Art and Design. He taught or TA'd classes in both places. He's exhibited his work or addressed events in Halifax, Banff, Vancouver, and Victoria. He works in several media, including printmaking, letterpress operation, bookbinding, etching, photography, and relief. And as you'll see, writing and research play central roles in his work as well. In Jacob's intellectual and aesthetic analysis and production, but also in his contributions to the Centre, there's this strange, understated, radical orientation. He presents the most beautiful, gripping insights in such a gentle, compassionate manner that one sometimes finds oneself 10 minutes into what seems like a cozy conversation, and then one realizes that one is actually talking about the very nature of reality or the darkest corners of the human condition. It's a weird and wonderful sleight of hand performed regularly by the best artists and activists. Although Jacob's political interests are not the explicit front and center topic of his work, generally speaking, one just needs eyes to see and ears to hear, and then it's all there. Sotto voce, perhaps, but there. And so I know he joins us in our wish to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and the Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. A quick word about format. Jacob will speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then he and I will engage in a 20-minute conversation. Those of you who have seen our new Scholars in the Square format will know that the interlocutor plays a special role in our format. And because this is my last Artist in Residence event that I'm going to be chairing, because this is my last year as director, I very selfishly decided that I was going to be his interlocutor. Plus, every time he's kind of taken a lead at the Centre in our coffee conversations, I'm just so impressed. I thought I want to get as much of him as I can before I have to leave. And this is going to be followed by a period of conversation with those in the room and those on Zoom. Food and drink are available as well, as you've noticed, and Jacob's work is kind of around the periphery of the room for you to check out after. So please join me in welcoming Jacob Maddison.
Hi. Super nervous public speaker, really excited to do this. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone at CSRS, for helping me along, for sharing with me over this last almost year, academic year. As Paul said, my name's Jacob. I'm a printmaker and visual artist. And for this residency with the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, I've made a collection of 6 small journals. They're scattered kind of on the back table, and they represent wanderings, thinkings, drawings, photography, kind of bound in 6 little collections. So hopefully everyone's able to take a look at some point. But for the talk, I've put the kind of rolling slides of them as they're presented on the screen behind us. Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks. I'm going to try something a little different than a traditional artist talk. So instead of explaining, I want to take you with me, create an experience of the work itself, a wandering. When I move somewhere new, the first thing I notice is the way things smell. The air here is salt and warm rock, with a hint of sweetness carried in the wind, the undercurrent of things drying out. I follow my nose through the meadows and shores of unceded Lekwungen territory, watching crows and gulls pick through the sand, fighting for food scraps among twisted driftwood. Tree roots ball up against exposed rock, gripping the earth, holding on against wind, rain, and tides. Fish bones scatter the soil, left bare against the dry ground. I pick them up and roll them in my hands, feeling the past resisting burial. The oak trees rattle their dry leaves in the fall, and in summer they pattern the ground with dappled light. I am the stranger here. I've been lucky to call this land home for a little while, yet I'm always aware of my temporariness. This land holds stories that are not mine to tell, and yet I find myself listening to them for them anyway, pressing my hands to the dirt as though it might remember me back. This is ultimately the starting point for today. What is hereness? How are the stories that shape our communities able to exist without nationalist ideology, free-floating and unmoored, but actively present in community and solidarity with our neighbors? The land has always been important to me, how it holds histories like piles of bones turned to dirt, webs of mycelium connecting those ghosts of the past, our past, and the stories of others. These histories weave their way into today, into territories never ceded. There's a children's book I've been rereading with my kid, Something from Nothing. It's about a child whose beloved possession wears down over time, yet their grandfather finds ways to salvage it. A coat becomes a vest, then a tie, then a button, until eventually nothing remains except the story. The story alone is always enough. Our town, once nestled in Europe's forgotten corners, sought solace amidst the chaos of pogroms and unrest. In those troubled days, the townsfolk entrusted their hopes to an age-old ritual. They would send forth the rabbi into the deep embrace of the woods. Amidst gnarled roots and silent stones, they would search for a sacred connection, an elusive spot where legends merged with the earth itself. The rabbi knew the spot, the words, the melody, and the ritual. I can picture them, kneeling by a weathered rock cloaked in moss, surrounded by the cool embrace of forest shadows. A fire would flicker into being, its flames painting ephemeral portraits on the canvas of night. Prayers rose like smoke, intertwining with melodies as old as memory, and dances etched into the very soil beneath their feet. Time wore down the edges of our communal memory, generations passed, and the rituals faded into whispers, preserved only in the bones of our stories. Yet the stories were always enough. I remember a particular moment which unfolded like a developing photograph. I was in a city park far removed from the secluded woods of our ancestral town, nestled amidst the unassuming hustle of a historic metropolis. I found myself drawn to the gnarled base of a majestic tree, its roots exposed like tangled webs, and its bark aged to ash. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows that seemed to dance in silent reminiscence. As I stood there, my thoughts wandering back to that legend, Could this be the spot where centuries ago our rabbi knelt beside a muddy rock and kindled a fire of hope? The rational part of me scoffed at the notion, yet a flicker of possibility lingered, a fragile ember of connection between past and present, of rituals and magic and protectors formed from the dirt. When darkness once more loomed over our town, a new custodian of faith ventured into those ancient woods. They stumbled over unfamiliar paths, unable to grasp the exact cadence of forgotten songs or intricacies of sacred steps. But in the quiet depths of their heart, they carried the essence of our tale, the whispers of hope and the echoes of resilience, and it was enough. And so it was, as the cycle of seasons and sorrows turned, each generation finding its own thread in the tapestry of our collective memory, we scattered across distant lands, carrying with us the fragments of our past, weaving new prayers into the fabric of tradition, sharing embers of those long-lost places that might catch somewhere anew. As I wander, I too will dig new holes and ask the earth beneath my feet to hold me safe. Our experience of the world emerges in torrents of language, though for me that language is never my own. I move through a syntax that was forced into me, the sharp slap of a steel ruler, the condescension that met my diffuseness. Concision was always the highest goal, but the flows inside my head remained untamable. For years, this felt like a burden, a broken pathway between sensory experience and linguistic expression, a disconnect not just in writing, but in my ability to name the world around me. Lately, I've come to realize that I write in English, but my being corrects me. The colonial impositions that haunt this land wage battle with my primordial wiring, one that longs for portmanteaus, for soupy words that spill from many sources, for looping structures and meanings that tangle rather than resolve. When I write, much like when I think, each sentence is an erasure, a translation, a forgetting, a palimpsest written over my long-lost tongues. It is the tension between the thought patterns we are taught and the patterns that pulse inside our very construction, our atoms, our cells, the vibrations of our matter that leaves me with a gaping fissure, a wound that resists comfort or stability. Reprieve comes in how the land pushes language back out. The many local tongues whisper their vocabularies into the wind, reminding me that I am not alone, but part of a vast, fragmented majority whose themness is being erased, who navigate the world through a foreign language. The land holds the dialects of many, the infinite ways of being, of holding, of making, and sharing, and spits them back in the universal language, that of touch. Dust clings to sweaty ankles, mud slips between unsheathed toes, grasses brush, tickle, and slice along exposed skin, not as symbols, not as language, but as meaning itself. Touch resists translation, yet it is never neutral. It carries the strangeness of encounter, the uneasy intimacy of being pressed up against a world that is not ours, but with which we are nevertheless entangled. The world speaks in language older than victors, older than displacements, older than migration and flow. It is a folding together, a being that is primordial, one that will outlive the fragile bounds of our semantic systems, one whose queerness pushes back against our bodies with intention. There is space in these encounters with the earth for meaning beyond English, beyond the need to translate experience into dominance. Here language loosens, meaning resists containment, spreading rhizomatically, entangled with matter itself. These moments demand hereness, a being in relationship with the world, possible only when we shed the hubris of dominion over the earth. Diaspora is a book whose pages keep rearranging. It is rewritten with every subsequent journey, but also layered sediment, a tower of Babel, rising and collapsing in the same breath. It is a beast of woven intricacies, at times vulnerable, at times afraid, but always fighting to exist in its own way alongside place. I once stood on the unceded land of the Lauskis in wooded southlands of Poland. The air was thick with damp rot and memory. In the very back corner of a yard, the foundation of something long gone gave only a faint impression of rolling dirt, like a grave found in a field of tall grass. I traced the outline with my foot, feeling that my great-grandmother had once stood here, her fingers pressed against the very stone wall I had now confronted. The stone wall had collapsed into the soft earth with an uncanny rhythm, giving it the same ebbing and flowing that her fingers did in her final days, sagging between knuckles into a pallid and skeletal void, rearing back up into arthritic joint, draped with skin that hung loosely like vines. I remember her last night there. She had watched wet, heavy snow settle on the roof beams of their sukkah, its fragile branches bending under a weight they were never meant to carry. A candle flickered behind a glass lantern, the mist growing thick and swallowing the fields. The silence was unnatural. She said even the owls had ceased their calls. Dressed in her last clean gown, clutching what little food remained, she stared eastward as the world was swallowed into gray. I cannot stop thinking about her hands, how they reached for me in her final days, how they pointed at something unseen, collapsing inward like that ruined stone wall. Decades later, I pressed my palm to the dirt, as if the earth might answer her quiet question, where have you been? Photographs haunt me, faces looking back that I've never met, yet somehow recognize, a fissure sliced from life into a celluloid cell. That space between recognition and loss, where diebucks dwell. Diebuck, this shadow, this tether, lingers at the nape of my neck. It breathes colder than air, a whisper I cannot shake. It is not one, but thousands, layered, pressing in like hands on a shoulder, like the weight of history grafted onto bone. I move because they move, my spine pulled taut by threads I never asked for. A shadow drags beside me, invisible to all but me, its fingers curling into the loose thread of my sleeve, its voice filling the gaps in my own. My ribs ache where it has stitched itself in. I've never seen its face, yet I've seen it 1,000 times. Grainy, blurred, framed in glass, pinned to museum walls. I breathe it in like dust. I carry it like an inheritance. Somewhere, a whistle blows. It is a wound split open across generations. It is the smell of burning, the weight of a hand that is not there, the way silence is louder than speech. It is the train that never stops arriving, the ash that never settles, the lesson that never ends. We are bound together, joint to joint, tendon to tendon, a thread I cannot cut. I remember a train ride between Dresden and Prague. I stared out the window at a rail yard swamped with copper-colored tailing ponds, trapped between gravel embankments, the result of relentless erosion. Traces of wasted industry festered everywhere. The earth was red, the mud a thick oxide clay, filled with copper, iron, and carbon. Puddles of stagnant water oozed with rainbows of spilt oil. The rails, flaking and disintegrating in the moist air, formed a boundless maze of raw steel. The sky above was crisscrossed with a chaotic network of power and motion, forgotten lines and functioning ones slicing across a gray canvas. As the train halted, I caught sight of alien Soviet locomotives with bulbous noses sitting forgotten on dead-end tracks. Rust flaked and floated on the breeze like discarded feathers. Ghosts shimmered along the surface of the ponds and evaporated into wisps of steam. The spectral remnants of those transported, displaced, and murdered. Meanwhile, in another world nearby, a swan drifted lazily toward the edge of a marble-lined pond, dipping its crooked neck to snatch a scrap of bread. The train lurched forward with a violent shudder, squeaks and thumps marking its progress. The bodies of the passengers were carried eastward, but my mind was left suspended somewhere between movement and memory. The soil is never simply brown. It is a palimpsest of histories, each layer pressed into the next by the weight of time and loss. The red ochre remembers the blood of beasts. The black earth hums with the decay of leaves that have surrendered to it. A yellow glint in the loam betrays a fragment of something older. Pollen, carried by the wind long before hands turned the ground to claim it. The wind moves over the fields, stirring dust into the air, carrying the breath of things long buried. The scent rises sharp, iron heavy, its veins still damp with what they once carried. The land does not forget. It does not bury without remainder. Beneath the roots, beneath the layered husks of what once reached for the sun, the remnants press close, bone dissolving into loam, marrow thinning into the dark richness that feeds the next season's bloom. A flower bends towards the light, its petals thin as dried skin, its stem pulling taut from the earth that made it. It drinks from the past without asking, its color borrowed from what has rotten beneath it. There is no malice in its taking. The camas push through the damp earth in loose clusters, their blue-violet petals flickering in the low light, a quiet inheritance from the bulbs buried deep below. Where the soil is richest, where fire once passed, where hands once turned the land with care, they gather, their color dark as tide-washed mussel shells. Further up on the drier slopes, paintbrush flowers smolder in the grasses, their red tips too bright, too sudden, like licks of fire left burning, or earth bleeding color back into the air. What does it mean to be a guest in a place where the land does not know you, to love a place that will never claim you in return? As a child, I was lucky enough to drive from Musqueam and Coast Salish territory north to the traditional lands of the Kwanlin First Nations. Those summer drives were my first encounters with vast spaces and myriad stories woven into the long dirt roads and endless woods. 2/3 of the way north, there's a gravel parking lot and an abandoned gas station at a T-shaped junction in unceded Niska territory. As a child, I was struck by the eerie absence here. Rusting pumps, bowed by frost, stood alongside an old shed designed for heavy equipment and a small plywood shack. Its service window was missing its glass, yet its frame was stubbornly intact. Its roof buckled from winter snow, and the plywood was swollen from constant rain, which collected in dark pools of water that shimmered with oil. I remember feeling as if the wind itself carried whispered stories from that structure, voiceless of generations, all etched into the wood and left to linger in silence, only interrupted by the mischievous cawing of ravens. Sitting within its confines, warmed by a humble electric oven, a woman loses herself in the enticing aroma of cinnamon buns slowly baking. The stove, its enamel edges worn and flaking down to bare steel, bears witness to years of quiet use. Since dawn, she has remained there, a silent sentinel as the hours drift by, yearning for the pause of a passing truck or a brief exchange at the gas pump. Moisture seeps through the haphazardly stapled siding, and the partially shingled roof, battered by a recent storm, struggles to hold together. Listening to the steady drip of condensation on a single pane window, she is reminded of her solitude. The bare studs and loosely packed bubblegum pink insulation create an illusion of habitation against the rugged silhouette of distant mountains. I wonder what ghosts haunt that place. Stories the trees tell of hunters, travelers, of family and love, all floating, knotted together in that sublime and eerie junction. One afternoon, we drove east through the unceded territory of the Palestinian people. I was picked up in a worn red Mazda 323 with windows thrown down against the 30-degree day. As we drove, the highway transformed. The urban clamor yielded to dust-laden roads framed by guard towers and stark checkpoints. Structures made of dark steel I-beams with corrugated metal roofing stood lonely and foreboding. The asphalt released shimmering specters in the sunlight, softening the roadblock's edges. I watched as Palestinian cars were forced into long sun-baked lines for invasive inspections, each pause a small ritual of power and separation, while our car slipped through without a glance. We arrived in the settlement of Ariel. Here the landscape was an uneasy blend of the utilitarian, dusty, and bleak. We entered a modern, sparsely furnished dwelling. Inside, the linoleum floor was cool beneath my feet, a quiet canvas absorbing every sound, a creak of old wood furniture, the tired whine of an overworked fridge. The space was humble, yet it held its own history. Faded family photos clung to thin, bare walls, and a misplaced cockatoo chirped softly, a surreal, almost absurd counterpoint to the solemnity of the place. The air inside carried a heavy mix of stale heat, week-old coffee left behind by my friend's mother-in-law, and the heavy scent of lilies left to dry out in a vase. We worked together to entice the parrot down from on top of the fridge. Outside, the architecture of Ariel revealed its own narrative. Curbs painted red and white in geometric order, concrete guard posts with slotted windows, red clay roof shingles, and the streets that bore the imprint of modern control. The built environment contrasted against the shelved hills that hold traces of centuries of cultivation, out of reach behind woven steel fencing. Olive trees, generations old, withering, the water diverted to hilltop settlements. It is hard to believe an escaped cockatoo had brought me such a clear view of apartheid. There are moments in Israel, such as in this settlement, where it feels impossible to touch the dirt and feel for connection. Instead, the structures of state control define the flow of bodies through, over, and around the land, a completely hollow land. She marches through the narrow woods of other unceded territory, gaunt and skeletal. Her cheekbones jut sharply, her knees bony, her arms weak beneath the weight of all she owns, tucked into the folds of her worn clothes. The frozen air catches in her throat. February. Her breath hangs in icy clouds before her tired, bulging blue eyes. Wisps of once thick curls slip from a scarf fashioned from an old bedsheet. The road stretches straight, its mud gouged by passing vehicles, cutting through the remains of small farms. She knows these roads. As a child, she rode them in her grandfather's cart, wheat piled high, the tang of wheel grease and wood stain, the sweet dust of hay. Her father let her stay before the harvest and build a sukkah floored with farmyard straw. In good years, they hung grapes, braided garlic stalks into fronds. After dinner, they lay beneath the stars, looking through the leaves, listening to owls call and mice scurry along the stone walls. The ice cracks. She stumbles, falls, a sharp snap. Her tibia shatters. She cries out, tries to rise. A river of bodies flows past. Through the pines, their snow-heavy branches sagging, she catches a glimpse. A small whitewashed farmhouse with rosy red trim. Beyond it, a barn, hay bales stacked high, steaming in a ray of sun. She sinks to her knees but keeps watching. The rising warmth of the hay, the sweetness of manure, the recollections of birds preparing for their journey south. She drifts so fully into memory, she does not hear the shot. With time, her body surrenders to the soil. Fungi thread through her bones, unraveling what remains, passing fragments of her story along a vast, whispering network beneath the surface. The mycelium spreads, braiding, unbraiding, until one season it blooms. Poppies, blood bright, rise from the place where she fell, swallowing the last trace of her, their roots entangling in the echoes of her dissolution. Her atoms scattered, folding into the humus, drifting on the wind. Some sink into riverbeds, others are carried on ocean currents, swallowed by fish, and exhaled into the sky. They bind to new bodies, recombining, reforming, passing between creatures who will never know her name, yet hold a shard of her within them. Each breath, each pulse carries the faint vibration of her existence, woven now into the trembling fabric of the world. In one dimension, she's only a mark in a ledger, a statistic logged by the machinery of atrocity. But in another, she persists, moving between us, shifting, dissolving, reforming, participating in the unfolding universe where no story is ever truly lost. Doikayt. Doikayt stems from the German da, here, and the Yiddish suffix kite, which means ness, meaning hereness. Emerging from Bundist socialism at the dawn of the 20th century, Doikayt asserts that Jewish liberation is tied to the struggles of all oppressed peoples in their present local context, rejecting nationalism in favor of diaspora as a radical, lived solidarity. Doikayt is the weight of footprints in soft earth, the tether of memory that does not demand return. It is the refusal to be elsewhere, the insistence that justice begins in the soil beneath our feet and extends through hands held, languages exchanged, and histories entangled. It is not exile, not longing, but presence, an ethical relation to the world as it is, with the radical hope of what it might become. Doikayt is a tree growing through a fence, its branches spilling into neighboring yards. It is bread shared between strangers who will not stay strangers for long. It is the river that does not ask where you were born before offering its water. To live here is not to claim, but to tend, not to possess, but to weave oneself into the fabric of place, of people, of struggle. Doikayt is the understanding that liberation is not an elsewhere, not a promised land beyond the horizon, but the shared labor of building justice where we stand. It is the opposite of retreat. It is engagement, an ethical insistence on solidarity with the neighbors we have, not the myths we inherit. There are no conclusions here, no neat answers, only stories, fragments and impressions of something half remembered. If there is a thread between them, maybe it is this. To be in diaspora is to be always in motion, caught between remembering and forgetting, carrying a history that shifts beneath your hands, always becoming something else. And yet, somehow, the telling remains, and the carrying is so much more fulfilling than taking could ever be. Thank you.
Right. So now those of you who thought maybe you would stay home this afternoon and see, told you so. Wonderful. Thank you. That was beautiful. Is that on?
I'm getting some. Oh, I can't leave.
Hang on. Is Rachel getting the sound person? Okay. Thank you. I'm going to do my best not to be kind of a fanboy, as they say, but thanks very much. That was just so beautiful. Let me
Thank you.
start. I've got about 37 questions, but I'm only going to ask a few. Let me start with something you said right toward the end, which was to be in diaspora is to be in motion. And I wonder if there's a kind of an ethical cri de coeur here. I mean, both so that more settled peoples understand better what it means to carry, because you have that wonderful contrast between to carry versus to take. So I wonder if it's this contrast between hoping that people who are more settled come to appreciate that what it means to carry, or perhaps the motion comes to be seen as more indicative of more people. In fact, that many of us are in diasporic scenarios, right? Or maybe there's a third option, so that those of us who identify with the value of carrying over taking can come to have solidarity with one another. I wonder what we think about that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. For me, the idea of solidarity is really important. So for me, my rejection of nationalism isn't just in an Israeli context, it is total. And I think solidarity outside of that, outside of religion, outside of history, outside of nationality is core to creating any hopeful future. And so to go straight to the third, I think that's key. But you also raised the kind of notion that I also agree with, that this is not something unique to Jewish folks. And a lot of the Jewish history we're taught, a lot of our tragedies are taught as uniquely our own. And it is also my belief that they're not. And that's not to diminish the tragedy, diminish the loss, diminish what haunts us, but to recognize that when I see you, I see your own histories that are replete with loss and violence and displacement, whether that's European or other. We all carry that. And so my hope with some of this art isn't just to reach my Jewish family and kind of offer them new ways of thinking. It's also to kind of draw attention to how we think of owning the land we're in, or how impermanent our life is in that land, and why we would ever think that it's ours to claim.
There was a while in the academic study of religion, in fact, it's still the case, that when people would use the term diasporic religions, that they always meant kind of brown people, other religions. And I would say, well, what about people whose parents have an English accent or an Irish accent? Are they part of the diaspora? I mean, and let's say they're Anglican. Are they part of the Anglican diaspora? Do we think of them that way? Because the reality was that the term diasporic was shorthand for a particular kind of other. And so for a while there, I kind of went to war against that category. And at a big academic conference I was at, where I was critiquing this category, so someone stood up and said, look, Paul, we realize that it's clunky, but it's better than saying Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs. And I said, well, but maybe that's the nature of the kind of post-colonial moment, that things are going to be awkward for a while. And perhaps using this phrase, this term that actually is kind of comes from the Jewish context to refer to all other non-white people is problematic, and maybe drawing attention to the problem is useful. And I wonder if that's part of what you're doing in your kind of critique of nationalism, is to draw attention to the problem of diaspora. And also the way you kept referring to unceded territories, but also in Poland, right?
Sorry. Part of the desire is always, in my work, has always been to trace those commonalities. And so to address the unceded, we all do land acknowledgements. We all, in some way, perform some realization of where we are in space. But I also like those conversations to be in conversation with other genocides, so that things aren't siloed and separated. And for diaspora, I mean, I think the thoughts that I carry and the stories I tried to share might be familiar to Huguenots and, I don't know, people escaping Ireland and so on and so forth. It's not, in my view, not something uniquely, brown or even Jewish or unique in that way.
One of the things I appreciate about your work is the way you sort of mess with time and space. You use pronouns to I, we, and you also sort of move through time and space quite a bit. Like you say, you talk about, I remember my grandmother, right? And you talk about the terrible story of Hannah echoes so many others, especially I'm thinking Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and others. And it ends with this weird collision between the sweetness of memory, her beautiful capturing of this memory of that day that she's looking at and the house she's looking at, and the brutality of her murder, the sort of sudden finitude of that murder. And I wonder if this is kind of a collision between dominance and escape that you're evoking in your own experience of Doikayt.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I don't actually know how to answer that directly. But I will use this opportunity. That story of someone being shot was the starting point for about almost 10 years of work. And it's because I was reading a family tree and there was a page. As our family trees go, you go back far enough, you hit the Holocaust, people start to disappear. And because the Germans were so fastidious about this stuff, there's records for all of it. But the one mystery was one that just said shot in the woods and kind of left it at that. And this has haunted me ever since. And to have someone reduced to such a horrific and nondescript moment, to me, just lingered. And I've always wanted to know what she saw and what she remembered and what the layers of her life look like and how they went back from that moment, because that's never addressed.
The story you tell of Ariel and settlement of Ariel and the escaped cockatoo is both absurd and wonderful, but also kind of painful, poignant, I think, in some ways. The story gives you a chance to think about contemporary Israel-Palestine, and yet you approach the question of settlements and the question of, desiccated olive groves kind of obliquely, elliptically. You don't go at it directly. I wonder if you could reflect on that.
I've only been to the region once, and I was 19 at the time. And I think there are people ultimately better equipped to dissect it. But this moment that I went to the settlement in the West Bank has stuck with me, along with a whole bunch of other little moments. I was there for a while. And when it came back to me because I read this poem by Mahmoud Darwish called Soldier Dreams of White Lilies. And it's about this Palestinian poet's friendship with a 1967 soldier, and how their friendship survived them going to war. But in that, he realized that the soldier dreamt of places that weren't there, even though the soldier would never say so. So the soldier would dream of things like his mother's coffee, of white lilies, of places that don't exist in Palestine. And that's kind of how I felt about this house. It was this construction, this kind of false little piece of security that was quite hollow. Does that do enough?
Yeah, sure. Anne Michaels, in her beautiful Fugitive Pieces, wrote that one should try to be buried in a land that remembers your name. I don't know if you remember that line. It really resonated with me. Is this possible for a diasporic people and community?
In that, like, I would like my body to return to the places that mattered to me. So what the earth does with it means less to me than knowing that I could end somewhere that I was part of in some way.
But you say places, there's a plural there.
There's a plural there, and there will always be places. I've been lucky enough to move a bit, and I'm sure I'll move again. And I will end somewhere, and that part of the story will end there and dissolve there and reconstitute matter there. And yeah, I don't know. There's no kind of romance. Well, no, there is some romance in that, but there's no plan there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, see, I mean, you're quite at ease with this sense of your own fluidity, your own being in motion at all times.
Not dying.
Not dying as such, but the sense of motion and the sense of belonging in many earths, perhaps, when you die. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the ways in which, in the current moment, by current moment, I mean the last century, there is an effort in some sense to de-diasporize. In other words, to perhaps overstate one's claims to this territory and that territory. We see it in Ukraine, we see it in Canada, We see it in Russia. We see it in Israel, Palestine. We see it all over the world. This effort to kind of romanticize one's connection to the land, to make it permanent, to make it impossible to negotiate. And that in some sense is moving in the opposite direction that you're talking about. You're talking about a kind of a diasporic consciousness, which is your own consciousness. It's consciousness of many Jewish people. It's a consciousness perhaps of the modern or postmodern era. And yet I wonder if you could speak about the kind of countervailing orientation that we see in our cultural moment.
So like ethno-nationalism.
But even, I mean, we never use that phrase kindly, right? But you just think about it, like the territorial acknowledgement and a lot of the questions that a lot of the solidarity many of us have around Indigenous revitalization rests on narratives of this being their land from time immemorial, right? And many of us are fine to go along with that story. Same thing with the story of Ukraine and versus Russia, that these are two separate peoples. And so many of us, out of a kind of a loyalty to higher values of solidarity and justice, are willing to go along with these stories that are the opposite of diaspora stories. They say, I belong here. I am not just belong here, I'm from here. I am of here. But you're talking about a different kind of richer. You're talking about a different kind of self-consciousness.
I don't want to speak for any Indigenous folks and their feelings of the land or ownership. But I do think that we could all use a little less certainty about things and realize that people move, names change, languages evolve. Nothing really in this universe goes back, or in our lived universe goes back that far. And yeah, and I think that's the way I've been trying to look at a lot of political issues as well, as like, there aren't neat answers. Things don't synthesize into a solution. They often devolve. And if you can find beauty in that ambiguity and peace in that ambiguity, I think there's a lot more possibility. And so that's kind of how I think about land here. So I like to learn its history. I like to try to learn its languages. I like to hear how different peoples have moved through it, and know that there's an uncertainty in all of that.
I mean, as you know, you're sort of, yes, that's like music to my ears, really. So I really appreciate the metaphor, the palimpsest, which shows up several times in your work, which I appreciate very much. And I wonder if I could just push you a little bit to be a bit of a devil's advocate, but ask you to reflect on how you reconcile the realization that, as you put it at one point, every sentence is a palimpsest written over long lost tongues, with the need for language to also create communities in which we can trust one another. We can trust what the other person says, that we're living within a kind of a common linguistic world, and which we have a sense that there's a kind of a shared reality, right? So if we are to adopt an approach to language and reality and belonging and identity, which is fluid, as you're recommending, and as I think your work kind of evokes how beautiful this can be, what do we do about the other wish to have a kind of a shared world in which we can speak about something that is true and real, right? This is sort of the crisis of truth and the crisis of trust, which I think many of us in the political world are running into all the time these days.
So I definitely think about that when I write things that are sort of fictitious, that try to blend truth and reality, even in the form of the work. Like, I've set them in an institutional form in the books themselves that gives authenticity, or at least borrows authenticity. And so it's definitely a tension that I don't think is perfectly resolved. As far as language, like the inspiration for the section on language and how I've begun to think about my own language was both a rejection of how I was taught language and how I was taught to use language, and the limits of that I've had to unlearn my own apprehensions about, and my own school traumas about, but also a willingness to listen to other people's languages and kind of listen to the words that other folks call places and things, and absorb that as well, and not feel limited. So in my kind of utopic vision, that's an opportunity for a lot of coming together, a lot of seeing each other as different, but of the same, and creating relationship. Does that make sense?
One last question. You write that you are not able to touch the dirt and dig for connection in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And yet that's the one place. When we think about the concept of diaspora, it's dispersed from a place. Like that's the root of the term. It's dispersion from a place, from that place. And yet in this kind of poignant irony, that's the one place that you cannot, as you put it, touch the dirt and dig for connection. I wonder if you can just reflect on that.
This observation, I don't think, is universal to the region, to Israel-Palestine, but definitely in the constructed regions of Israel, that was the impression I got. Like things are paved, gravel is put on top of dirt, gardens are manicured in a certain way, palm trees are tended to in a certain way. It had a certain distance. And I was a little reticent to put the contrast in my work because you can find that here. You know, we pave paradise all the time. But yeah, there it was particularly striking. And in the settlements, it's even more. You're often on hilltop, you're often fortified, your roads are protected from heavy vehicle traffic so that military vehicles can come through. You know, it's like, it's just that level removed. There's this beautiful book. Well, it's not particularly poetic, but there's a book called Hollow Land, and it's an architectural examination of Israel-Palestine done by Ariel Wiseman. And they're an architect, and in this, what was their PhD dissertation turned into a book, they examined the layers of construction. So using similar poetics to what I try to think about the land we're on, they're using it to dissect the levels of control. So how people pass under other people and over and around. And yeah, so that's kind of the inspiration there.
But when you were younger, did you expect to be able to feel, you could touch the dirt and feel a connection?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to grow up with some skepticism, but also some romance. So at 19 years old, you're told this place is for you. It's fairly powerful, and it takes some background nagging, some knowledge, some other things to see that separation. And I was 19, so there were drinks, there were beaches, there were blue sky, it was warm, there were, you know, things that a 19-year-old might like motorcycles and people with guns, and it was weird, it was wild, it was a movie for me at the time. And it's just as those stories sit and filter that you can really start to appreciate the little things, the racist comments, the built structures, the way you never really sat in anywhere that felt just natural.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, Jacob. Okay, so we have now about 20 more minutes for conversation, and Scott is wishing me back in here. We have microphone, B's got it, and if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand and B will come around and give you the mic. Yeah, Alina, hi. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. And I'm just wondering if you can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I am just wondering if you can talk a little bit about your artistic approach and process. How do you bring these things together? And the stories that you were telling, probably very old, and do you keep the journal? Does it appear? How it works in your memory? Just wondering from an artist's perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the books, great opportunity to talk about the books that are on the back tables. They're long accordion fold books. Each one kind of tackles one of the themes through the talk, more or less. And they're collections of photographs and drawings that I just keep. So folders and folders and folders of scanned film photos, and then iPhone photos, and then digital camera photos. And then the writing process for me is I have too many Google Docs just cascading everywhere. And so I just then go pull things and then rewrite them together and then pull more things and then delete things. So it's just a bit of a mess. So if you want to know the artistic approach, it's just is.
Thank you. Tori.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Lovely talk. I would be curious, um, when you became a father, how did that alter your conception of what it means to be diasporic?
I think that's a really hard square to circle, circle to square. It's this combination of wanting to create safety and security for someone while also hoping that they'll never grow up to demand the place as their own. And so in doing that, for me, it's being in nature and being with them in the world and teaching them to care for where they are and care for the people around them, to build relationships, to be willing to talk about these hard things, even though they're quite young, so that they understand that their safety is to be appreciated without kind of, my kid's 5, so I'm not scaring them. But just, yeah, trying to balance those two things. And I do think it's hard. It's not, the thing I really want to implore in them is that they can be here and Jewish, and that's great. And that they don't need to look elsewhere. And I think that's the important thing, not just for them, but for all of my family. And yeah, I just hope they find that and they're able to find that care.
Todd.
And I'll just say the other thing about parenting is that 5 or 7 years goes by between working on a piece of art.
Hi. So I just want to drill down a little bit on what Paul was talking about, sort of this question of historical claims to territory. I teach Chinese history and I write about Chinese history and religion. And one part of my approach is to try to bring to light the ambiguity of identity and claims to identity within that history. And so I'm just wondering, in your case, especially visually, because you talked a little bit about it when you're answering Paul's question to do with language, but I'm wondering visually with your work, how do you, have you thought about creating that ambiguity? And if not, maybe can you reflect on how you can create that visually?
I mean, so in the bookworks themselves, the images of place and the stories and bits of writing roll over each other in a totally non-linear way. The books are also covered from both sides and can be read narratively from both sides. The images themselves try to be of things that might be recognizable if you've been there and taken the same photo, but are hopefully a little ambiguous in that they're not of Parliament or they're not of these exact things. And if they are, they're not from here. So there is more there that I think time spent with the book the book objects themselves might offer. In terms of aesthetic choices themselves, I've kind of thought of these 6 books as little sketchbooks. So they each kind of take a different visual approach to trying to find that combination of kind of welcoming a viewer in and wanting to get them immersed, but also willing to push against their sense of self and place and narrative arc, if that makes sense. Did you want, is there anything yeah.
For those of you on Zoom who didn't catch Todd's observation, he's talking about how much he appreciated the non-linearity. Yeah. Actually, I appreciated that timeline-wise. You didn't say, you didn't sort of make sure we all knew, now I'm in Poland, now I'm in Israel, now I'm back in Coast Salish territories, right? So you let the story do that for you, which was quite interesting. You made a decision, right? You could have said, I'm going to go from, you know, Victoria, and then I'm going to go to Israel, and I'm going to go to Poland in the 1940s. And why did you do that?
For me, all the stories exist now, so it doesn't particularly matter. I had previous work that I put up in a gallery that ran the narratives randomly so that they would be in conversation. And something like that really like tickles that itch for me of not wanting to give hierarchy or separation or ultimate meaning to things. Though when you're giving a talk, you kind of have to make that decision and try to land with something impactful, or hope you do in some way. So this was the kind of the closest I could make to that feeling.
I love that when you I earlier on mentioned how you kind of blur time and space and you use pronouns in evocative ways. And I loved at one point you said, I remember, you're talking about your grandmother, I think. I remember her last night here. Yeah. I just, this wonderful, like you remembering something that is in someone else's life experience.
Yeah. So this, that feeling, I think for me came from W.G. Sebald, who could write in this way that just bounced 6 layers deep through people's inherited memories and then back to a present and just rocket around in a way that wasn't avant-garde, wasn't jarring, was just beautiful layers of depth on and on and on. I can't write like them, but it's like I aspire to that feeling.
Pretty impressive. Shubham.
You're fantastic. Trust me. In regard to Paul's question of the diaspora, there was this, in your answer, you said romance. And when we are discussing about non-linear, there is this idea of nostalgia that's imagined, and especially when we talk about diaspora and through generations, there is memory, or there is this idea that goes through the intergeneration, which is often imagined. So I could read that sort of nostalgia, which is imagined, which is felt through somebody else's memories, through somebody else's experience. Could you talk about that too? And also, Paul, if you could simplify your the diaspora question, because that was fantastic too. Thank you.
Simplify it, or did you say?
Simplify.
Oh, I just meant that right now I think we see in our culture on the one hand this shift in Jacob's direction, which is the direction of seeing all of us as provisional, diasporic peoples, but on the other hand, also communities saying, no, this is our place. It's always been our place, and it will always be our place. So people having this radical, romantic, permanent view of attachment to place and identity, and other people saying, no, I'm good with, I'm half this and half that, and I'm living in Coast Salish territories, but next week I might not be, and so there is this kind of tension. But sorry, I want to get.
Um, Nostalgia. The thing that's struck me more is something that I would call, I've heard called prosthetic trauma, or kind of this idea that communities will graft on traumas and force you to live them and force you to inherit them in a way that is really damaging. And I'm trying to find a way to carry the truth of some of our trauma in ways that allow it to become diffuse and integrated into other stories, so that it's not one myth that can then be manipulated and weaponized. So this theory was kind of popularized around 9/11, where people who had no relationship to New York or to the Twin Towers were shown images and put in museums or in exhibits that were so traumatizing that they felt that fear. And in feeling that fear, you're vulnerable to being co-opted for political reasons. So in the Jewish community, this is the function of a lot of Holocaust memorial. It's this placing you in that fear zone, making you feel it so deeply that you know it could happen again, and then leaving you vulnerable, not offering you a way to carry that elsewhere, not a way to reimagine those moments in ways that offer a beautiful resolution or something more. So I've been kind of trying to find something that offers, not the trauma of that, not kind of a nostalgia that can equally be weaponized, but kind of something nebulous and in between.
This question's from Dan. Jacob, you say that you're against nationalisms, but presumably are Canadian. Do you intend to renounce your nationality in order to live a truly diasporic life? And by way of comment, it is easy to sing the praises of diaspora while enjoying the protections, privileges, and rights of being a citizen of a nation, a modern nation state such as Canada.
Thank you, Dan. I think this is a problem with a lot of our politics right now, is that we can't imagine better futures and realize we have to live in the reality we've inherited. So yes, I don't really believe in a nation state as an ideal. I don't really care that Canada is a structure. I'm sorry. But I live in it and I participate in it and I vote in it and I'm here, and this is just the reality of the world that I'm trying to negotiate. So yes, again, those things are in tension. There's no perfect resolution. There's no perfect answer, but I'm trying as an artist to imagine things and ways of being that are outside of the way things are right now. Like that covers?
I think so. I mean, in response to Dan's question, would it be fair to say that the expression of your Doikayt, your hereness here as a Canadian, would be to recognize the privileges you've inherited just by being born here, and yet be suspicious of the pride that might come with that?
Yeah, I think so. And it's a bit like another thing I don't love is capitalism, and I think that isn't uncommon when you stop and think critically about it. But I still have to feed a child, put a roof over my head, exist in a world that is built around exchange of capital in order to survive. And living in nation states is the same. We're here, they exist. I think the most ethical thing to do is build relationships within them, push back against them where you can, find liminal spaces where you can carve out something more human than their structure. But I still yeah, I'm still going to exist. I still pay taxes. Like I'm still here.
Brian.
Thank you so much, so much there. One of the things I'm just intrigued about is how you have managed to choose a form for expressing those that embodies the substance of what you're doing. They're unstable, they're constantly, and these are the books, they're constantly in motion. Sorry, they're, did you hear the first part? Okay. Just, I'm just so impressed by how you've managed to pick a form for conveying the stories, the thoughts that embody the very substance of what you're trying to do, of using, and people can't see them if online, but because what they saw was moving, but these accordion books, they're unstable, they're constantly in motion, like Diasporic. So do you want to just talk about how you came to choose that form?
I'm a bookish person from a bookish people. And so there's kind of a comfort there for me in terms of the feel. I understand it. I can play with it. For these, I was thinking in a scroll-like way. I wanted them to be able to pass along through time and have that sense, that Torah-like sense of rolling over. And the instability and kind of form of the accordion felt very natural. It was something that I thought could be viewed in this way. It can be both intimate and, like you say, kind of spring out of your hands. The set itself has a slip case, so it can all be contained in a volume and shoved on a shelf. But then when you pull it out, it loses all its structure. Yeah, thought the metaphors were unfolding.
Particularly impressed how, with that accordion shape, as you're going through it, you've got the past, present, and future all at the same time. So I think it's brilliant what you've done.
That's a great question. Second last question. So the last question goes to Catherine.
I'll try. So I'm wondering how art school influenced you. You know, there's a deep poetry in what you've done, and both an artistic and a verbal poetry, because I can see the words are just as important. But you have been through art school, and in many ways, what you're doing has had expressions over the last few decades of instability and margins, and you know, moving away from you know, our cliches and our structures. So how did art school influence that? And what do you read theoretically? Or do you put all that in the trash to do what you're doing?
He did have a section on Derrida, actually, but he took it out.
I just didn't reference it. I should say, so in our art school, especially through my master's, I read a lot of theory, and I'm finding that the theory I breezed through or partially skimmed or photocopied and highlighted and tossed away has been floating to the surface lately. So I feel like even though it's been 7 years or so, I feel like a lot of that learning and a lot of that time I took out of my life to just work on work has been filtering up to the surface. But yeah, lots of little bits of philosophy, lots of little bits on language, on media criticism, on a bunch of stuff shows up. And I do find as the way I write it's responding more directly to theory than it is to reading poetry or reading prose. It's a section in here will be for someone. Like I could go through and tell you the section that's from Derrida, from Deleuze, from different people, from Levinas, from these different thinkers that matter to me. And but yeah, they're not cited. There's a beautiful book by Roland Barthes called The Lover's Discourse, which has this rolling marginalia that the writing doesn't have to reference the references. It can kind of exist as two columns. And that's kind of how I wrote my original master's thesis. And that's still how I think about fiction. In my head, there's always rolling marginalia that some work I can include in and some work it doesn't make sense to.
That's a very nice place to end. Thank you very much, Jacob. So thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm really glad that Melanie was able to be with us today because she really is in some sense the scene of the crime for being so gifted as she is to inspire this whole thing and for Yvonne as well to make it real and to really help us give it some support. So thanks everybody. This is also probably my last time I'll be hosting Artist in Residence Artist Talk. I turn it over to Rachel Brown, who is, as many of you know, the incoming director of the center. So yay. And the last big event we're doing, it happens April 26th, and it's a 1-day event where we're talking about spirituality and the environment. So we're going to have the first half is going to be on the natural environment, and the second half is going to be on the built environment. So we're going to be bringing in architects, social planners, theologians. It's going to be really tremendous. So check it out. It's online. And thanks very much. Have a good rest of the spring. Thanks. See you.